The massive windows of Nexus Prime Academy stretched like endless mirrors, reflecting the swirling colors of distant galaxies. Inside the grand hall, rows of students from 100 different worlds sat in perfect silence. Their skin, scales, and exoskeletons gleamed under the soft blue light, each species more exotic than the last, except for one. Yura Park sat alone, her dark hair pulled back into a simple ponytail, her fingers moving quietly across a worn datapad. Around her, the alien students kept their distance, not just physically, but in every possible way. They whispered, they stared, they judged. To them, Yura was nothing special, just another human. Weak, ordinary, forgettable. But they were wrong. The lecture hall buzzed with an electric tension. Today was the annual Interstellar Strategy Assessment, a test that would determine the future of every student in the room. Holographic displays flickered to life, casting complex diagrams and intricate star maps across the polished floor. Kim watched Yura from across the room. He was the only other human in the advanced program, and he knew something the others didn't. Humans were never truly what they seemed. Another human, muttered Krell, a reptilian student with razor-sharp scales, taking up space in an academy meant for real warriors. The comment was loud enough for Yura to hear, but she didn't look up. She didn't react. Her eyes remained fixed on the datapad, her fingers continuing their precise dance across the screen. Nearby, a group of silicon-based life forms from the Andromeda cluster leaned together, their crystalline bodies shifting with each whispered word. Humans are relics, one of them said, its voice a soft, crackling sound. They were powerful once, maybe, but now, they're just survivors. Survivors. The word hung in the air like a judgment. Yura knew the stories. Her grandmother had told her about a time when humans were more than just another species trying to exist in the vast, unforgiving universe. There were stories of incredible battles, of strategic victories that had changed the course of galactic history. But those were just stories now, ancient memories fading like starlight. The lecture hall's temperature control system hummed softly. Holographic displays continued to dance with complex calculations and star charts. Each student was preparing for the assessment, their various appendages and sensory organs working in perfect sync with advanced technology. Jay took a step closer to Yura's desk. He knew her potential. He had seen glimpses of something extraordinary hidden behind her calm exterior. But in this moment, to everyone else, she was just another human. Quiet, unremarkable. A warning light flashed on the main screen. The assessment was about to begin. Yura closed her datapad. Her hands were steady, her breathing calm. She looked like someone who knew something nobody else did. And perhaps she did. The first holographic challenge materialized in the center of the room, a complex three-dimensional map of potential military strategies. Alien students leaned forward, their various sensory organs focusing on the intricate display. Yura Park simply smiled, a small, quiet smile that would have scared anyone who truly understood what it meant. The assessment was about to begin, and nothing was going to be the same after today. The visitors' hall of Nexus Prime Academy was not a place where students usually met with high-ranking military officers, especially not human ones. Admiral Helena Rodriguez stood by the massive window. Her uniform was old, her medals were simple, but something about her made everyone stop and look. She wasn't just another officer. She was something more. Yura sat across from her. Jai stood nearby, watching carefully. "Do you know about the Trilateral Nebula campaign?" the Admiral asked. The question hung in the air. Most students would have said no. Most would have looked confused. Yura just waited. "Your great-grandmother," Rodriguez continued, "changed everything during that campaign." A holographic display flickered to life. Star systems appeared, massive fleets, impossible battles, and at the center of it all, a single human strategy that had done the impossible. The story was simple, but nothing about it was easy. 3 advanced alien civilizations had joined forces. Their technology was beyond anything humans had seen. Their weapons could destroy entire planets. Their strategies were perfect, unbeatable. Except they weren't. Yura's great-grandmother, a strategist named Elena Park, had seen something nobody else could see. She didn't fight the enemy. She understood them. She knew their weaknesses before they knew them themselves. Most people think humans just survived, the Admiral said. But we did more than survive. We transformed entire galaxies. The holographic display showed incredible moments. A single human fleet moving through impossible spaces, redirecting entire enemy armadas with nothing but carefully placed communication signals, breaking alliances, changing the very rules of engagement. Yura listened. Her face showed nothing. But her eyes were taking in every single detail. Ja knew what was happening. This was more than a history lesson. This was a message. Your family has always been different, Rodriguez said. Not because of weapons, not because of technology, but because of understanding, because of seeing what others cannot see. The display changed. Images of Elena Park appeared, a woman who looked surprisingly like Yura. Sharp eyes, calm face, someone who looked like she knew something nobody else did. They tried to hide these stories, the Admiral continued. They wrote humans out of the official histories, made us look like survivors, not strategists, not architects of galactic change. More images appeared, battles that had reshaped entire star systems, diplomatic moves that had stopped wars before they could begin, strategies so complex that they seemed like magic. Why are you telling me this? Yura asked, her first words. Admiral Rodriguez smiled. A dangerous smile. A smile that suggested something big was coming. Because history is about to repeat itself, she said. Outside the window, the stars seemed to watch, waiting, listening. Yura's hands were steady, her breathing calm. She looked like someone who had just discovered a very big secret. And perhaps she had. The past was not dead. The past was waiting. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for what would come next. The simulation chamber was unlike any other room in Nexus Prime Academy. Its walls were pure white. Its floor seemed to float. Holographic projections could turn this space into anything: a battlefield, a distant planet, or a complex mathematical puzzle. Today, it was a test of strategy. Each student stood at a digital platform. Floating screens surrounded them like protective bubbles. The challenge was simple, but impossible. A no-win scenario that had defeated every previous class. The simulation began. 3 massive enemy fleets appeared. Impossible angles, unbreakable formations, defensive positions that seemed to cover every possible approach. The other students began to panic. Their fingers moved quickly. Their alien technologies hummed with complex calculations. Yura was different. Her hands moved slowly, carefully. She wasn't fighting the simulation. She was listening to it. Jay watched from the sidelines. He had seen this before. Not with his own eyes, but in stories. Stories his grandmother told about human strategists who could see patterns where others saw chaos. The alien students around Yura were struggling. The Crexian student to her left was sweating blue liquid. The silicon-based life form to her right was making high-pitched sounds of frustration. Their complex algorithms were failing. Their advanced technologies were useless. But Yura? She saw something else. Her fingers touched the holographic display. Not frantically, not desperately, but with a calm that seemed almost impossible. She was moving pieces, adjusting tiny details, creating spaces where others saw only solid walls. The simulation's artificial intelligence began to take notice. Most students tried to fight the system. They pushed against its rules. They tried to break through its defenses. Yura was doing something different. She was working with the system, understanding its logic, seeing its hidden pathways. Impossible, muttered the supervising instructor. The holographic fleets began to shift. Yura wasn't destroying the enemy. She was redirecting them, changing their very purpose, making impossible moves that seemed to rewrite the rules of engagement. One by one, the enemy fleets began to break apart, not through force, not through direct conflict, but through an understanding so deep it seemed like magic. Jay smiled. He remembered his grandmother's words. "Humans don't just fight," she would say. "We understand. We adapt. We change the entire game." The simulation reached its final moments. Every other student had failed. Their platforms were dark, their hopes destroyed. Yura's platform glowed bright. She had won. But more than that, she had solved the impossible. The artificial intelligence of the simulation began to analyze her approach. Lines of code scrolled faster than any eye could follow. The system was learning, changing, adapting to something it had never seen before. When the final results appeared, the room went silent. Perfect score. 0 casualties. Complete mission success. The alien students stared. The instructors were shocked. Jay just nodded, as if he had known all along. Yura looked up. For just a moment, she caught Jay's eye. A small smile crossed her face, a smile that said she knew something nobody else did. The first hint of power had just been revealed. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for what would come next. The Advanced Strategic Design Lab was quiet. Too quiet. Yura stood at her workstation, surrounded by holographic displays and complex machinery. Her latest project, a theoretical adaptive communication network, was her most challenging work yet. Months of research, countless sleepless nights. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. Narek, a senior Vortex student, moved silently behind her. His multiple arms worked quickly. Tiny mechanical devices slipped between the delicate sensors of Yura's equipment. A small smile crossed his scaled face. Sabotage was an art form in the academy, and Narek was a master. The project assessment was in 2 hours. If something went wrong, Yura would fail. Her entire semester, her entire academic future, would collapse in an instant. The first signs of trouble appeared slowly. A tiny fluctuation, a small error in the data stream. Most students wouldn't have noticed, but Yura was different. Her fingers moved across the holographic interface. Something was wrong. The communication network was breaking down. Connections that should have been solid were crumbling. It was like watching a perfect machine slowly fall apart. But Yura didn't panic. Jay watched from across the lab. He knew that look. The same look his grandmother had described. The look of someone who saw problems not as walls, but as puzzles waiting to be solved. Narek watched too, his confidence growing with each passing moment. Soon, Yura would fail. Soon, she would be exposed as just another weak human. The lab's advanced sensors began to alert. Error messages flashed. Red warning lights started to pulse. Other students looked up, their various sensory organs focusing on Yura's workstation. "Looks like another human can't handle real technology," Narek muttered loudly. But something was happening. Yura's hands moved faster, not in panic, not in desperation, but with a calm that seemed impossible. She wasn't fighting the system. She was rebuilding it. Lines of code danced across her display. Complex algorithms shifted and changed. Where others saw destruction, Yura saw opportunity. The communication network began to stabilize. But more than that, it began to improve. Narek's confidence turned to confusion, then to fear. What should have been a complete system failure was becoming something else entirely. Yura was redesigning the entire network in real time, adapting, changing, growing. The lab went silent. Other students watched in shock. The instructors stopped their conversations. Even the advanced artificial intelligence monitoring the lab seemed to pause. Jay allowed himself a small smile. When the final assessment came, Yura's project not only passed, it exceeded every possible expectation. The adaptive communication network was now more efficient than anything the Academy had seen before. Narek's sabotage had failed. Worse than failed. It had revealed something extraordinary. As the lab cleared out, Yura packed her equipment. She looked calm, quiet, almost invisible. But something dangerous flickered in her eyes. She had just shown everyone that humans were far from weak, far from finished. And this was just the beginning. The history lecture hall was a marvel of alien engineering. Walls that could change color, floors that shifted like living things, holographic displays that breathed with information from 1,000 worlds. Professor Kirill stood at the front of the room. He was massive, a reptilian creature with skin like polished bronze and eyes that could cut through steel. When he moved, everyone listened. When he spoke, the entire room went silent. "Today," he announced, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very walls, "we will discuss the great galactic conflict." Yura sat perfectly still. Her back was straight. Her eyes were focused. But something inside her was burning. The holographic display came to life. Star systems exploded into view. Massive battles, incredible technological displays, entire civilizations rising and falling like waves. Most students watched with mild interest. Some looked bored. A few took careful notes. Professor Kirill's clawed hand swept across the display. "Many species fought," he said. "Many species fell. But who truly dominated?" He paused. His gaze swept the room and landed directly on Yura. "Certainly not humans," he added, a hint of mockery in his voice. Several students chuckled. The silicon-based students clicked their crystal formations. The reptilian students hissed with soft laughter. Jay tensed. He knew what was coming. Humans were lucky survivors, Professor Kirill continued. They adapted. They ran. They hid. But they never truly conquered. Another wave of laughter rippled through the classroom. Yura remained still. Her face showed nothing. But her hands, hidden beneath the desk, were clenched into tight fists. The holographic display showed battles. Incredible technological marvels. Massive starships that could destroy entire planets. Weapons that could tear holes in space itself. And through it all, humans were shown as footnotes. Small, insignificant. What Professor Kirill didn't know was the true story. The stories Yura's grandmother had whispered to her during long nights. Stories of strategies so brilliant, so unexpected, that entire civilizations had crumbled. Humans were never true warriors, Kirill said. They were survivors, nothing more. Something changed in the room. A tiny shift, so small that most wouldn't notice. But Jay saw it, a spark in Yura's eyes, a tension in her shoulders. The lecture continued. More battles, more displays of technological might from other species. Humans were always shown as the smallest part of the picture, always pushed to the edges of the story. But Yura knew different. She remembered her grandmother's voice. "We didn't just survive," she would say. "We transformed entire galaxies. We changed the rules of war. We made impossible choices." Professor Kirill finished his lecture. The holographic displays faded. Students began to pack their things. "Another unremarkable human," Kirill muttered, just loud enough for Yura to hear. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Jay approached her desk. "You okay?" he whispered. Yura looked up. For just a moment, something dangerous flickered in her eyes, something that suggested the professor knew nothing. Absolutely nothing. "I'm fine," she said simply. But something was coming. Something that would change everything. The lecture was over. But the real story was just beginning. 1 year later, the Interstellar Collaborative Research Institute stood like a beacon of hope. Its walls were made of crystal that changed color with different light. Its halls connected species that had never spoken before. Yura Park stood at the main window. She looked out at the stars. Everything had changed. After the tournament, after the revelation, after proving what humans could really do, she had a choice. She could have demanded respect. She could have sought revenge against those who had ignored her people. She did something else entirely. The Institute was her creation, a place where different species could truly understand each other, not through weapons, not through competition, but through real communication. Jay worked beside her. They had become more than friends. They were partners, creators, people who saw the world differently. We're not just solving problems, Yura would tell the students who came to learn. We're changing how problems are understood. Alien students from 100 worlds came to study. They learned something different here. Not how to fight, not how to win, but how to see connections, how to understand. The Institute's main research hall was alive with possibility. Holographic displays showed complex systems, communication networks that connected entire star systems, ways of thinking that broke all the old rules. Professor Kirill, who had once been her biggest critic, now worked as a senior advisor. The tournament had changed him, had changed everything. Humans are not what we thought, he would tell new students. Humans are architects of understanding. Yura's great-grandmother's lessons lived everywhere, not in weapons, not in direct conflict, but in seeing the invisible lines that connect all living things. The research was changing everything. New communication technologies, better ways of solving complex problems, methods that helped different species understand each other. Admiral Rodriguez visited often. She saw the future happening right in front of her eyes. Your grandmother would be proud, she told Yura. Outside, starships from different species moved together, not as enemies, not as competitors, but as partners, as people trying to understand each other. Yura remembered all the times she had been ignored, all the times people had said humans were nothing special. She could have been angry. She could have sought revenge. Instead, she created something better. The Institute became a beacon, a place where different species could truly communicate, where understanding was more important than winning. Jay watched her work. He knew what she was doing. She wasn't just creating a research center. She was changing how entire civilizations thought about each other. The artificial intelligence of the Institute continued to learn, to grow, to see connections that no one had seen before. As the sun of a distant star began to set, casting colors across the crystal walls, Yura smiled. This was more than a victory. This was a new way of existing. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for what would come next. The Galactic Strategy Tournament was the biggest event of the academic year. Every student wanted to win. Every species wanted to prove they were the best. The arena was massive. Holographic displays covered every surface. Hundreds of students from different worlds waited. Their technology hummed. Their hopes burned bright. Yura stood with her team. Jay was right beside her. They looked small, ordinary. Nobody expected anything from the human team. That was about to change. The tournament worked like this. Teams would face a complex, multi-dimensional strategic challenge. They had to protect their own resources. They had to attack enemy positions. They had to survive. Most teams brought massive computer systems, advanced alien technologies that could process millions of calculations per second. They had backup plans, backup systems, backup everything. Yura's team was different. She had a simple datapad, a few basic communication devices, and something else, something nobody could see. The first challenge appeared on the massive central display, a star system in complete chaos, multiple enemy fleets, shifting planetary defenses, impossible terrain, dangerous radiation zones. Most teams froze. Yura's fingers began to move. She wasn't fighting the simulation. She was listening to it, understanding its hidden rules, seeing patterns that nobody else could see. Jay watched carefully. He recognized the strategy, the same approach his grandmother had described, the same approach that had changed entire wars. The other teams used their advanced technologies. They pushed. They fought. They tried to break through with pure computational power. Yura's team did something else. They began to move slowly, carefully. Each move seemed strange, impossible. The other teams started to laugh. The judges looked confused. But something was happening. Yura was rewriting the entire simulation, not by force, not by power, but by understanding, by seeing the hidden connections that nobody else could see. Enemy fleets began to change direction, not because of direct attacks, but because Yura was changing the very environment they moved through. She was creating pressure points, invisible pathways, ways of moving that broke all the usual rules. The other teams watched in shock. One by one, the enemy positions began to fall apart, not through direct conflict, but through an understanding so deep it seemed like magic. Alien students stared. Judges stopped breathing. The entire arena went silent. Yura's team was winning, but more than winning. They were solving the impossible. When the final results appeared, nobody could believe it. Perfect score. 0 casualties. Complete mission success. The human team had done what no other team had ever done before. They had changed the entire game. Ja looked at Yura. She caught his eye. A small smile crossed her face. A smile that said she knew something nobody else did. The tournament was over. But something much bigger was just beginning. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for what would come next. The challenge came from Professor Kirill. He stood in the main lecture hall, his massive reptilian body blocking the light. His eyes burned with anger, with something that looked like fear. "We cannot accept this," he said. His voice shook the walls. "A human cannot have done what she claims." Yura sat in the front row, calm, quiet, watching. Admiral Rodriguez stood beside her. The old military officer held a small data crystal. Inside were records, memories, proof of something much bigger than a simple tournament victory. The entire academy was watching. Alien students from 100 different worlds. Professors with technologies beyond human understanding. Everyone waited. Professor Kirill attacked Yura's family history. He spoke about humans as if they were nothing, as if they were just lucky survivors, as if they had never done anything important in galactic history. "Humans are not strategists," he said. "Humans are not leaders. Humans are." Admiral Rodriguez interrupted. With a single motion, she inserted the data crystal into the main holographic display. The room went silent. Memories appeared. Battle records, diplomatic communications, strategic plans that had changed entire star systems. And at the center of it all, the Park family. Generations of humans who had done the impossible. Yura's great-grandmother Elena appeared, a woman who looked just like Yura. Sharp eyes, calm face, someone who understood something nobody else could see. The records showed everything. How Elena Park had stopped 3 advanced civilizations from destroying each other. How she had created communication networks that transformed entire galaxies. How she had seen connections that no other strategist could see. Professor Kirill tried to speak, but no words came out. The records were perfect, clear, impossible to deny. Alien students leaned forward, their various sensory organs trying to understand what they were seeing. Professors checked and double-checked the data. Everything was real. Humans were not just survivors, Admiral Rodriguez said quietly. Humans were architects of galactic peace, creators of impossible solutions. The holographic display continued to show memories, battles, diplomatic meetings, moments where a single human had changed everything. Professor Kirill's confidence began to break. His anger turned to something else, something that looked like understanding. Yura remained calm. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She was simply showing the truth. Jay watched from the side. He knew what was happening. This was more than a challenge. This was a moment of change. The Academy's artificial intelligence began to process the new information. Lines of code scrolled faster than any eye could follow. The entire system was learning, changing, growing. When the final records finished displaying, The room was completely silent. Yura stood up. She looked small, ordinary, nobody special. But everyone knew different now. The stars outside seemed to watch, waiting, listening. Something big had changed, and nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for what would come next. The aftermath of the tournament was like a storm. Professors argued. Students whispered. The entire academy was talking about nothing else. How could a human team, a team everyone had ignored, completely change everything? Yura sat alone in the Strategy Research Center. Her fingers moved across holographic displays. She wasn't celebrating. She was working. Jay watched from the doorway. He knew that look, the look of someone who saw the world differently. "They don't understand," she said quietly. The tournament victory was more than just a win. It was a message that said humans were not what everyone thought they were. Not anymore. The simulation technology they had used was supposed to be unbreakable, perfect, created by the most advanced minds in the galaxy, designed to test the absolute limits of strategic thinking. Yura had done more than break it. She had redesigned it. Her approach wasn't about fighting. It was about understanding, about seeing connections that nobody else could see. She didn't attack problems. She transformed them. The research center's artificial intelligence began to analyze her strategies. Lines of code scrolled faster than any eye could follow. The system was learning, changing, growing. Most students would have been celebrating. Most would have been showing off. Yura was different. She was preparing. Outside the window, the academy looked the same, but everything had changed. Alien students who had laughed at humans now looked confused. Professors who had ignored human potential now looked worried. The entire academic world was shifting. Jay brought her a cup of water. "They're going to try to stop you," he said. Yura nodded. She knew. The strategy she had used in the tournament was more than just a clever trick. It was a completely new way of thinking about complex systems, about understanding how different parts of a problem connect. Her great-grandmother's lessons were everywhere, not in weapons, not in direct conflict, but in understanding, in seeing the invisible lines that connect everything. The research center's main display began to show her complete tournament analysis. Most students would have created a simple report. Yura created a living, breathing map of strategic possibility. She wasn't just solving problems. She was showing how problems could be understood. Professors began to arrive. First one, then another. Soon, the research center was full of the academy's most important teachers. They looked worried. They looked excited. They looked afraid. Yura continued working, her hands steady, her mind clear. She knew something they didn't know. This was just the beginning. The artificial intelligence continued to learn from her strategies. Each moment brought new discoveries, new ways of understanding complex systems. Outside, the stars watched. Something big was coming. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for what would happen next.